Hey guys, my name is Akshita. I'm a data analyst and a travel enthusiast.
I'm Anagh. I'm a finance bro and a tech geek. And you're listening to The Why Quadrant, the weekly podcast where we discuss the why behind human society and behavior.
Lessons from pop culture and our own experiences to lead a more intentional, efficient, and happy life.
Hi, Akshita.
Yeah, we really do need a different intro. Hey, hi Anna, how are you doing?
Good. Uh, it's been a while since we recorded a new episode of the podcast. How's your week been?
Yeah, it's been a while since you've spoken actually, so a lot of catching up to do. Week's been fine, it's been
Yeah,
quite
yeah,
hectic
yeah,
work-wise. So I've also
yeah.
just driven back from Goa to Bangalore, so just yesterday. So good to finally be back home.
Oh, that's nice. That's nice. So you continue the tradition of switching geographical locations between every episode.
Yeah, I think it's gonna happen next week as well. Let's wait and watch.
All right. So let's introduce our guest for the week. So today we have uh, Abhishek Warrior from Canada joining us, and he has a very interesting topic that we discussed today. But before that, Abhishek, why don't you introduce yourself?
Yeah, definitely. I grew up in mostly in Mumbai, and after I did my high school, I did about 2.5 years in the National Defense Academy in India. So I did about army training, and life's a roller coaster, and shit happens, and it kind of like I was like, okay, after this injury, what do I do? So that's when thought about Canada, and came here, did a geology degree, and graduated from that. I've been working as a mineral exploration geologist for the past 4 years or so. It's pretty cool. It just takes you places, and you get to experience like a lot of like raw things in terms of nature, wildlife, people. So it's a pretty exciting career and field. And I don't know if most people actually understand what an exploration geologist does. So I see it as like a couple of people that are working on a treasure hunt. So the clues that we get in the treasure hunt would be geochemical signatures in the ground, and we try to like identify a deposit, say like gold, silver, and precious metals and stuff. So yeah, so that's pretty much my quick um, overview of what an exploration geologist does in my journey.
Oh, so when I was talking to Abhishek, when I heard what he does, I thought that is the closest thing to having like being Indiana Jones in real life. And I think what your description was today still fits that
True,
description.
true.
But
I
we're
think
really
it's
excited
very
to
interesting.
have you. We're excited to have you here, Abhishek. Welcome to the Y Coordinate. And yeah, so let's jump into the topic for the evening, which is uh, basically a comparison of individualistic versus community-driven societies. So, which would be Western societies are more individualistic, whereas Eastern societies are more community-driven. So, Abhishek, would you want to get started with exactly what we mean by individualistic? Or
Yeah, definitely. I think for me, like growing up and then coming to Canada, I think that the sudden sense of like change was pretty drastic. The way how like people are very welcoming, but once you get to know the people, the sense of society is individualistic, which would mean by putting like oneself first before the society itself. So the association, the consciousness of like associating you first over the society would predominantly mean an individualistic society. And in a collective society, growing up in India, it's a more collective in the sense that like when you talk to your family, you're putting the needs of the family first. Their sacrifices you're putting before the individualistic needs. the association is like kind of like we as like a community per whole as compared to just the individual person. Yeah. So those, I think that's just the overarching difference between the two societies.
So you mentioned it in terms of like putting yourself above the community or above the society, but I also feel that it's also to do with like your day-to-day interactions in terms of like what I've felt is that people in Eastern societies, for example, in India, everybody's up in everyone else's business, and families are fairly close knit. Whereas in the West, people give each other a lot of space, and there's not too much that sort of everybody does not have their noses up in everybody else. Do you like, what are your views on that? Like, do you feel that is part of this definition, or that's on a different tangent?
I think that the association of kind of like differentiating the two would be like, hey, when you are growing up, you have a sense of choice per se, right? So like as like my nephews and nieces in Calgary, like even when they grow up, they have the opportunity to pick whatever cereal you have for breakfast. Like they have like between 4 or 5 different cereals. So that like sense of like independence and making the choice early on is very was something like I couldn't like wrap my head around. It's like, oh wow, that is really cool. Like as compared to India, like I never had it's whatever my mom thought was best for me was what I got, right? So coming back to your point, I think that like difference between the two kind of like associates with the sense of like putting like the self first as compared to like the society itself. And yeah, so yeah, I think that's like the overarching thing about that.
Okay. Akshita, what do you feel about this? Is that something that you observed as well?
I think what you said, Anagh, and what Abhishek said, they definitely are very different things, but then also sometimes they do go hand in hand, because what Abhishek is talking about is more about what he said, right? Putting yourself, your needs first versus your family and your community, all of it all together. But what you, Anagh, are basically talking about is somewhere, I'm not sure if it's the same as that, because it goes hand in hand. So in the community, when you're, suppose you're like in India, and although you are taking care of your needs along with your family and your relatives and your community in general, you're also, while doing that, you're also in each other's, up in their business, right? I mean, it's not possible to be apart or distant and still have that feeling of community for doing everything for each other, with each other, along with each other. So I think they go hand in hand, versus where in the Western countries, because you're so like, not so dissociated, but because there is a certain degree of separation from your immediate community as such, you do tend to choose to put yourself first. So for me, in my head, these two things may go hand in hand. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's like one thing leads to the other kind of situation.
And I think like when I was thinking about this, like I wondered why, like what's the origin of the difference and change, right? So it has to do a lot with like the geographic location and weather. Weather is a pretty big factor to that. Like say in Edmonton, when you have snow and stuff, and when the weather is like -20 over the span of like few months of the year, it's hard to kind of like socialize in an outdoor environment, as compared to like when I was in Cuba, like the neighbors, they would just like open the door and talk to the other neighbor across their house for like 3-4 hours. It's the sense of like community has to do with the weather conditions. Like it's a pretty big factor I've felt. And also like this also has an effect into how their emotional quotient is and how they're able to like socialize in a communal setting. I feel when you don't have that constant day-to-day interaction with people, you tend to like lose that the communal feeling, and then you forget how to associate with people and connect with people in a more deeper way.
So, okay, let me first address what Akshita was saying. So, Akshita, I did not say that these two were different points. I was just trying to understand what is the cause and effect, because I do agree that both of these things go hand in hand. When you have, people living so close to each other, then you, like, for example, in India, if you have putting your family above you, you obviously need to be in their business to know what is their priorities. But is putting someone else's priorities above you the effect, and having that community like being up in each other's business the cause, or is it the other way around? Was something I was trying to understand. And in terms of the weather, Abhishek, I agree with you on the fact that the weather can be a factor, but I would think it would be the reverse, because like if you talk about a tropical environment where food and agriculture and everything else isn't plentiful, that community actually does not need to interact too much with each other, because everyone has enough for themselves. Whereas in an environment like Alberta, where it snows all the time, there is more rationing of resources required, and maybe you run out of X amount of things, X kind of things where you might want to exchange and have like a more closeness. So at that point of time, on that point, I'm not sure if I agree with your like weather hypothesis. But that okay, we went over 2 3 points. I want to address also. Then the third point about community based society having richer interactions. That I agree with you 100%. Like being in a society where it's more community driven, people are generally more warm, people are used to forming deeper connections faster, quicker, and I've experienced that myself, interacting with different kinds of people from communities where this is a trend, where people are up in each other's business. I found it much easier to kind of scrape through the initial surface and have deeper conversations with people much quicker than people from societies where that's not the trend. And that you, I think, have hit the yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think I want to like go back and like I feel so in say in like tropical places where you have stuff in plentiful. I feel like that the rationality about that is a little bit like contentious because even though you have like self-dependence in the West, people are more self-sustained. They already for the winter, like not right now, but like going back in time for centuries and decades ago, people had to like survive through the entire winter by themselves on just like meat and potatoes, and potatoes was easy to store, and your hunt from the kill. So you're not constantly trading, you're not constantly like having that like barter system. So that sense of like trade and the constant like exchange of one resource with the other person kind of like builds that the sense of like communal being in a society is what I think. Like take for instance, like this has like repercussions into the way how like people see the society in different parts. Like when I was working as a geologist up in Ontario, we have a drilling rig that has like a pretty big environmental footprint. So before you start the drilling process, you're supposed to talk to the landowners and compensate them for the work that is being done on their land. But in Canada, when we had to deal with the situation, even though it was through the entry point for that was through a community start, like starting from like a communal start into someone's private land, we only had to compensate the person's private property as compared to, when I was working in Uganda, when before we started our drilling program, you had to go and talk to the village chief. You got to talk to all the local hierarchies. The hierarchy in a communal society is much more defined and much more concrete. So compensating people in the hierarchy, compensating the whole village in itself, and then the village making sure that everyone's like employed during that course of the drilling phase. That I think that was like a very big stark difference. Is like, that is. I wonder why that's the case. But that like sense of like association with the other person in a tropical place that like Uganda is very crucial. um, and I guess like in the long run, it kind of like benefits the uh, the village in itself per se, because we employed people and we had to fix the roads. So the whole village itself, was benefited from the whole process. So yeah.
Okay, fair enough. I guess what I wasn't considering in when we're talking about the temperature was possibly there are not too many items in terms of variety to really barter for. So if it's chicken potatoes, then there's really no need to go out and exchange stuff with other people. And also, I guess when it snows, it's not very fairly accessible to unless you have some sort of living arrangements where multiple people live together as a community. If they're living in individual I don't know, igloos or caves, then anyway that accessibility is not there. From that standpoint, I guess you're right then. Whereas in like a tropical environment, I guess there's much more variety of things that are produced, so there's more of a reason to kind of collaborate and interact, whereas if that number is limited, maybe not. So yeah, that's a viewpoint that I can agree with. Now okay, so let's now move to like specific examples of or maybe key characteristics of like a community-based society versus a individualistic society in terms of what defines it and whether like what are the pros and cons of each, if you may.
Yeah, definitely, for sure. So individualistic society, like I think the main thing will just going back into what individualistic society, like it kind of like fosters like independence and like that the self of like making a choice. The independence of making a choice is really crucial in an individualistic society. And in addition to that, I think people in individualistic societies are more self-expressional about their personal choice. And in addition to that, I feel like it's a more like equal society as compared to a collective one, whereas like people can move from one socioeconomic background up the ladder much easily as compared to a collective society. And then like the sense of like ownership is very strong in an individualistic society. Comparing it to a collective society, like the interdependence is very key, and that's the crucial. Like what would my actions affect my family? How would my actions affect the group? I think that is kind of like the main key core principle of like a collective one. And also like in a collective society, people tend to like follow the norms more so in terms of like your elders, or like a hierarchy. They tend to like give hierarchy way more respect. And there's this more sense of like collective ownership as compared to like a private individualistic ownership per se in like a individualistic society. So that I think those would be the key differences between the two. And it's it's interesting. The whole pandemic, you can see the response of different countries that kind of like associate from like an individualistic standpoint as compared to a collective standpoint. So like especially in the US, not after the vaccine rollout, but at the start, you could see like a lot of people that like, hey, it's my right, and I'm free to choose what I want. If I don't want to wear a mask, I won't wear a mask. Like I'm not really worried about the collective, population or society in a whole, as compared to China or Japan or even Taiwan, which has pretty phenomenal response to the pandemic. People are more aware that, hey, this is what I need to do so that like my society, country, or community is more careful, and we get over this challenge in a much quicker and more swift response.
That's a very interesting point you make. And uh, so first thing I want to talk about is, do you feel that there are parallels between individualistic society versus a community-based society, with the two forms of government political ideologies, between more left-leaning versus right-leaning, and what one would overlap, individualistic versus community? Because while you were speaking, I was trying to see if they fit in, but there are traits of left-leaning society that could fit both. I don't know what your thought.
I think in an individualistic society, they're definitely like, well, say, take for instance for Japan, the way how like Japan kind of like comes together with with a new change or with a new policy in the government. The sense of like consensus is put at a very high pedestal. So because of that, the agreement and kind of like tackling the point from different perspectives is put at a higher importance as compared to an individualistic society. Hey, okay, this is what a particular a lobbying agency is, pushing their policies towards getting this policy done. So what is the best interest for me as a party, or what is the best interest for me as a left leaning or right leaning? That is I think that is what is it in for me? That is always the majority question, right? And I mean, in terms of society itself, like, I mean, this is kind of like remnants of the culture, what was like, long ago. Right now, I would probably say with globalization and stuff, we're more a hybrid of sort. It's not like we are either or. It's kind of like hey, there are parts of this that come out in a particular sphere, and there are parts of like the collective society that comes out. So kind of like you step forward and step behind in terms of that.
Akshita, what are your thoughts on?
I might be way off on this particular thing, but when you mentioned about society and how politically, I remember, so I've not done finance or economics or any of these as a background, but I remember back in 11th grade when we were studying economics, there was something about the centrally planned economy versus the marketplace economy, basically, which is what my layman understanding at 11th grade, my 11th grade underdeveloped brain was able to understand was, one is basically government centrally controlled versus one is free will of individual people. So I don't know, this suddenly came up in my brain when I was thinking of it. And the examples of these particular economies are also very similar to the Western versus the Eastern culture that we are talking about. So I'm putting the question back to you, Anagh. Do you think that this is the reason why the culture in these societies is it because it's the way the economy has been for a while and that's how they have been imbibed into it? I mean, I might be way off because I'm literally trying to remember something that happened like that I've studied years ago. But yeah.
So I don't know about the cause and effect, like the previous discussion you're having, whether it's because this sort of mindset was there and that is why that sort of an economy was developed, or that sort of an economy was there and that is why the community kind of grew on that kind of a model. But Abhishek, do you have any thoughts on that?
I think it's kind of going back to like the origin, right? Like, I mean, like geographic location, weather, and like all that has the way how people have been like interacting with one another. That's, I think, what today in present day age is kind of like that, the pathway how people have maneuvered and like gone through all those situations over a span of time. And I think yeah, like, well, like I said before, like location geographically, in terms of weather, in terms of like the bond and stuff that like the families have. the sense of like sacrifice that you have to make in those societies. I think you see that even in the way how the government structures, like, so for instance, in collective societies, there are more opportunities for governments to kind of like provide grants and like, erase off like a loan and debt, and like, hey, they kind of like understand the society in general from like a 5 or 10 year standpoint, and they probably like work their way towards, hey, this is what we want to achieve in 10 years, let's start planning. I feel like in an individualistic society, it's way more people are like competing from through their lobbies, and there are lots of self-interest. And when you have a lot of self-interest, you never really like achieving the goal of the society itself. It's like one person's, or like whoever has an economic power in terms of like control, they would have their best interests served in an individualistic society. And as a part of that, like say comparing that, you can like see in America, it's like most of the big companies, they have kind of like thrived in the capitalistic culture. So I think capitalism definitely thrives in an individualistic culture. Like the whole thing about like capitalism, like the core principle of capitalism is like rewarding the people who really works the hardest. That person gets more opportunities, that person's allowed to grow mobile. But present day and age, what's come down to is who can we take the most advantage of, like in terms of companies, in terms of resources, in terms of like other things. And the end goal is like, it tends to kind of like favor the people in power and help them move more, as tend to be like a communal benefit from that thing. Yeah.
True. I mean, but I feel like on the flip side, even community-based societies, like for example, if you talk about India, or even if you talk about the USSR, I mean, in concept, they're supposed to be more community-driven, but in application, they've also started because people are selfish, and if there's anyone in a position of power, if you talk about the communist USSR, even then, instead of what is idealistically supposed to be done, instead of in terms of what is best for community, people still act in their self interest sometimes. And in that respect, then I feel, I mean, okay, what I was trying to get at was like, between the two, what do you think is like the better way of approaching in terms of an individualistic or a community-based society more at a macro level?
Like what is more beneficial to society, you mean?
Yeah, or what gets the optimal result at the end after all the interactions and everything been accounted?
Well, that as like economists, they kind of like generalize a lot of things so that it's much easier for them to understand different concepts. In terms of like if you talk about what is how would you quantify that would be my question. If you were to quantify that in terms of GDP, you already have the answer to that, right? I mean, we are still in this like day and age where things are changing, like in terms of like the capitalist versus like the individualistic versus like collective society is kind of like, I would say, a little bit synonymous with capitalistic versus the communism era. I would probably compare them per se, and then you already have the answer. Like in terms of like in terms of GDP, like US is much stronger than any of the other economies of the world. And if you were to compare that to per se China is like it did start with like a communism, but it China in this day and age, in the past since the 90s and since the past few decades, they are way more capitalist than any other society, right? So I think I think individualistic society definitely, even though it doesn't, you know, benefit the society in general, it definitely benefits the person, which helps the whole society in itself.
In that, yeah, in that respect, I guess you're right. I mean, the capitalist society does end up coming out better because of, I guess, the implementation is because if you think about it theoretically, if whatever is the idea, then a community-based society would be better because you're kind of accounting for everyone. It's not a function of who has more power, whether economic or monetary or political. And the communal outlook looks out for even the little guy, but in implementation, I guess that is where it fails, because of which the individualistic society turns out to be better, because then everyone at least has the same fighting chance. Like you said, there's more socioeconomic mobility. Would you
Mhm.
agree with that? What do you
Yeah,
think?
I think. See, I think the main question is like how do we compare what is better, right? Like what are the factors? Is GDP the only factor that we are comparing, or is it like human happiness index? And take for Bhutan, for example, with I would probably say like Bhutan is probably a more collective society, just um, pretty much similar to the whole entire region in that area. But people tend to be um, much happier in terms of like, I think a few days ago, like they were able to like vaccinate almost like 90-95% of the population in a week. So that is like phenomenal. I mean, obviously they don't have the population as much as China or US or India for that sake. But people tend to be happier, and I think that's the question. Like people should be asking, hey, what are we looking for at the end of the day? Is GDP, or how much how much money I make on a yearly basis, is that the most driving factor, or the sense of like having preserving our nature, having a very high happiness index, and people actually being content and are able to spend that time with their family, is that valued way more than the GDP, right? So I think it boils down to that, and each person needs to find uh, that that own sort of like identity and how they associate, and also like understanding that cultural bias in terms of decision making process. I think we tend to like forget with our with our country of origin, people move and like you go from one society to the other. What are my repercussions of my actions, and what's the repercussions of my decision on like society and communal? I think that we forget to ask that question, and we're we're in this like fast-paced world where it's things are like moving at a
Yeah.
pretty fast pace that we forget to like step back, introspect. I think uh, that's the main thing that we need to be asking ourselves, right? So
True, true, true. And just adding to your point, what do you like? Where would you put like the Scandinavian countries, where they're essentially, I would imagine, capitalistic societies, but because there's abundance of resources, like for example, the tax rate in those countries is extremely high, and like most of the infrastructure and everything else is provided by the government. So I feel like that falls somewhere between like a purely capitalistic society like the US versus, I don't know, maybe Soviet Union.
mhm.
Where would you like put that?
Yeah,
Go ahead.
yeah. So the Scandinavian countries, I feel they are a unique example, even though in terms of like geographically, they are in a more colder part uh, of our Earth. But in terms of how their society and life functions, it's a more relaxed, not really as cutthroat as comparing it to the US or comparing to fast economies everywhere else in the world. People tend to have more time to kind of like spend with family, spend with their community. So they develop a high sense of like association, even though it's a very individualistic. They tend to like develop the strong communal bonds, which make them more uh, per se like on a higher happiness index. And I think that's a model where most countries are moving towards.
Mhm.
In terms of like, you could see that the remnants of that even in their education system. Like the education system in Finland is one of the
Best in the
best in
world.
the world. Yeah,
Yeah.
because they focus more so on like, hey, how do we solve a problem? How do we, uh, how do we develop the skill as compared to like, hey, uh, how what is the monetary value of you learning this?
Mm, mm,
Uh,
mm,
I,
mm.
I think that shift needs to happen in our education system. And yeah, it's just been pretty crazy. Like even growing up in India, and then like you have it's either engineering or medicine, or like, hey, what is the monetary value of this education that you're going
Yeah.
to get in the future, right? I
Yeah.
think
Yeah.
like stepping back and thinking about that is really important.
True. 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 I think we should begin to wrap up. So, what would be like your final thoughts on the topic?
Yeah, I
Um,
think just going back would be understanding that like bias in a day-to-day life is really important. Hey, how do if am I more so on an individualistic perspective, or am I coming from more collective perspective? For me, the biggest learning challenges, like coming from India and adapting to life in Canada, was understanding that like a little later on. And I feel like if I had done so much earlier, it'll help in um, my social interactions a little bit better. It'll help in making decisions in a more efficient manner. um, and also like I feel investing in yourself is very important, especially during the pandemic. You know, we've forgotten to like take care of ourselves. Like the whole like collective. Everyone's becoming more collective
mm,
in the world per se. What is I'm trying to like help the society in general by staying at home and doing all this, but um, taking care of yourself is really important, and that stems down to the more the individualistic perspective. And you know so I would probably say understanding that like cultural bias, and seeing how those cultural bias would impact your decision making process as business leaders or people in the future.
fair point. I agree, Vijay. And Akshita, is there anything you would like to add? Final.
Um, Actually, not really. But you know what? This has been a very interesting outtake for me because I have never really lived outside India. So I have not seen these different cultural shifts or these different societies that you're talking about. But when you do talk about it, whatever I have seen or heard is something that does come into picture. So I don't have anything to add, but this is surely giving me an insight into how it is really like, honestly.
Fair enough. Yeah, I think today was today's discussion was like very, very again intellectually stimulating, and I also it made me think quite a bit about not just the societies that uh, I've lived in at a more micro level, but also at a macro level, and what else is out there and why things happen. So it's been nice. So I guess that wraps up this discussion. It's time for the next segment, which is the funny or insightful incident of the week. Is there any that you would like to share, Abhishek, as a guest?
Sure, yeah. Well, the weather has been a joke on me yesterday. The weather gods have been just playing like a funny joke on us, like early April. This is not the norm. I mean, we've been having such a um, shift in like weather patterns and conditions, so I wasn't expecting this. So yeah, yesterday evening I was just stepping outside, and there's this like family, mom and her daughter, just building like a snowman in April, right after spring and everything. So it's definitely funny.
That sounds, yeah. I saw this TikTok recently where there's something about weather in Canada in general. So like on Monday he goes out wearing a parka. On Tuesday he goes out wearing a parka. On Wednesday he's wearing like a Hawaiian shirt and shorts, and then again Friday he goes out wearing a parka because it's that unpredictable. uh,
Yeah, it
so
is.
Akshita, do you have
It
any
just changes by the minute.
insightful?
It changes by the minute and second, right? So you'll have you'll go from a very warm weather in the summer. I'm predominantly talking about that to rain in the afternoon to like probably like -5 at night. So it's it's definitely crazy. Just learn to adapt.
It's kind of like a all-in-one sort of a deal. I don't know how you dress when you go out. It's like you carry all these.
Never know how it's gonna turn out.
Yeah.
Interesting. No, I actually never thought weather would play such a important part in our lives. And even in today's discussion, when you said weather, I didn't really understand it at first. But then when you actually started speaking about it, I was like, hey, yeah, that does make sense. That does make a lot of sense. Yeah. What about you, Anagh? Do you have any fun, insightful?
No, man, I think the only insightful thing that we had, you were talking about this earlier, and Abhishek mentioned that, it started snowing, was that, like what I said, was that you think that when it snows, life is more terrible in cities and areas where it snows quite frequently. But I feel like if I have to pick between living in a city where it snows fairly regularly versus a city where it snows sporadically, I'd pick the former because the infrastructure and everything else is in place to handle it really well, to the extent that it stops bothering you almost none at all. Whereas in cities and areas where it snows sporadically and people are not prepared for it, so most of the times you'll be fine, but when it does snow, you'd basically be very royally screwed. So I feel like the extremes of, I don't know, comfort are much higher in terms of you being very comfortable versus not. And that's just an insight that I have, which I'd not thought about before.
Interesting. Yeah, and that is true. I mean, obviously, you'd rather be in a place that is well prepared for to deal with something than the opposite. I mean, I don't know if that makes sense. But yeah, I don't really have a funny or insightful story, but
Yeah.
I mean, I was actually talking to someone today. This is a random story about, so I'm not into F1 racing
Mhm.
or Formula One at all.
Mhm.
But I was talking to a friend who's actually an F1 racer. He used to race, and he was just telling me about
Oh,
this
wow.
entire story about Lewis Hamilton and the Nico Rosberg friendship turned rivalry situation. I don't know if you both of you all are into it, but basically the background of it is they were friends, they grew up together, they learned together, and eventually the friendship turned into a rivalry when they ended up joining Mercedes. I think they were both in Mercedes. So what his point was that
Yeah.
Nico Rosberg's mission became to basically end up beating Lewis Hamilton, because Lewis Hamilton apparently is one of the best of all times kind of person. So, anyways, he told me about how Nico Rosberg really took a year off and actually went like took a year off just to get his mental game in mental state into the game, and he actually went to the Himalayas, and he actually spoke to monks and studied philosophy, and apparently all of these different things that he did to actually mentally prepare himself for what it was to come. So that was quite interesting, because usually don't think people would want to take the break out of the game and lose that momentum to actually get their mental health and not mental health, I'd say their mental mindset in order. But yeah, that was something that's very interesting. I don't know if you knew about this. I've just given, I don't know if this is correct information. Also, this is literally something I spoke about someone an hour ago. So it was fresh in my head.
Mhm.
So yeah, please validate, guys.
No, it's definitely
Please
interesting to
validate my
know.
information.
I haven't like heard of this before. I know that they were like childhood rivals and all of that, but I didn't know that he took a year off to go to the Himalayas and all that. So that's
Yeah, I think before this I
fantastic.
should have validated it,
Uh,
but
I
giving a
guess it's time to
disclaimer
wrap
now.
up. Don't
Yes.
worry, we'll if we'll fact check this and come back next episode. So, anyways, I think it's time to wrap up. Thank you so much for joining us today, Abhishek. It was an absolutely amazing discussion, uh, and we were really honored to have you here with us today. Akshita,
Yeah,
do you
thank
have
you so much.
anything?
Yeah, thank you so much, Abhishek. As I said, I mean, I didn't really have a lot of I didn't have any idea about this topic, but listening to your different examples, your pandemic example, the fact that you worked in Uganda was amazing for me, and all of these different situations that you mentioned, they were quite insightful. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much. And I think explorative geology is one of the coolest things I've heard. As you said, very close to Indiana Jones. This is super cool. This was the most interesting field of education or profession, I think I've seen. Sorry, guys, no offense to anybody else, but like on our podcast. So yeah, it was quite fun. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much. Yeah, no, it was really nice fun talking to you guys. I mean, I'm no or expert on this topic. It's just that I guess when you kind of like sit back and think about like, hey, this is kind of like my journey. It's like you understand a lot of like self realization in the process. So yeah, I think it just gives everyone just thinking points about like, hey, what do I associate myself doing, and like what do I fit in? What's that cultural bias that I'm bringing to my workplace and a day-to-day decision? I think that is, I thought that was pretty cool. And, might also be because I did a minor in economics, but definitely I would love to, read more into it and kind of like understand the behavioral economics of that aspect. But no, it was really nice fun talking to you too. It's fun. I don't know how you guys do it. Like every week you manage to go and talk from like, from religion to TikTok to like a plethora of events. So like I don't know how you guys do it. It's insane. Really, I got to commend you too for doing that and actually pulling it off. No, it's quite a feat.
Thank you, Abhishek. But
Thanks.
I guess a big part of it is based on like for example, for today's discussion, you brought in all the insightful facts. We were just kind of adding it, so that really helped. But yeah, thank you once again for joining us, and hopefully we can do this again. Maybe a part two of this discussion in person later this year or next year once we're all in Toronto.
Yeah, definitely.
Um,
Hopefully, fingers crossed
yeah,
that it's in
I'm
person.